Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breakthroughs with Bree. On this podcast, we are discussing all of the topics that help us have breakthroughs on our personal and spiritual development journeys. My name is Bree, otherwise known as Healing with Bree, and I'm a channeler, energy healer, tarot reader, astrologer, and soul alignment coach. My mission in my work and in this podcast is to help teach people how to shift their consciousness, how to heal, and how to release beliefs and patterns and fears of their ego mind so that they can step into alignment with their soul to live lives of abundance, purpose, and bliss. In these episodes, I will be sharing either through my own lens and my own channel or through the experiences of my guest, wisdom and expertise about healing, spirituality, psychology, personal growth, holistic wellness, mysticism, consciousness, and so much more. My hope is that these conversations help you feel seen and provide support and inspiration for you with your own personal breakthroughs. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome back to Breakthroughs with Bree. Today I am sharing on a topic that I have been excited to talk about for quite some time, and that's been my personal experience with going from a really religious Christian background into more of a spirituality and consciousness approach now. I've gone through a lot of iterations of, relating to my past and my experience with religion and just even like theoretically how I think about it now with some of the information I have. And I've just felt like intuitively and from my guides that it would be supportive to some of you. I know I share that background with a lot of you coming from, like a very evangelical, like Christian sort of culture and finding my way to spirituality. So it feels like I'm going to share a little bit of how my relationship with both of those things has evolved over the years. I also had a conversation with my parents who are still, devout Christians, explaining what I believe and practice now in case maybe like hearing some of that language feels supportive to you if you're ever having those conversations with loved ones. And I also feel like I'm going to talk a little bit about how I created some shifts and some healing as it relates to what I had previously considered a little bit of religious trauma. So I'll just start with this. I did do an episode on my story and coming into my gifts where I talk a little bit more about my background. I'll put which episode that is in the show notes. I don't remember off the top of my head right now, but I discuss in more detail my background as it relates to all of this. So I'll just keep this pretty brief. I was raised in a very conservative city in a family that was very religious. My grandparents, used to raise money to do like missionary trips and, go to church every Sunday and Bible study groups on Wednesday nights. And, it just was like a very prominent part of my life. And even in high school, there was like a group of like sports people who were like doing Bible stuff, like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. That's what it was. I'm like, that was hosted at my house sometimes, so it just like was a really big part of like the expectations as I was growing up. And honestly, at the time was a source of stability and support on some level. I feel like I just naturally always would have been really spiritually inclined, especially with my Pisces moon in the ninth house. And, like that just always would have been something that I would have gravitated towards. And that was the framework that was given to me. And it was given to me in such a way to where this is the truth. Like this is the only version of it that's real. So if you want to be good, if you want to be loving, if you want to be all of this, like this is it, So, I just accepted that because of course you do. That's like all that you really know when you're young and growing up with people that you trust in your community. And that was that. And like I was super into it. Now, where things started to deviate and where I started to question things was around the time that I left my hometown and went away to college. I grew up in Bakersfield and went to college at UC Davis. And around that time, there was just certain things that were not feeling like true to me, like they just weren't feeling right. And a lot of that was like the judgment and condemnation of certain types of people, people who identified as queer or, that kind of thing. Like it just didn't really sit right with me, right? And a lot of the other like conservatively held sort of ideologies, which like felt very similar to me because they were all kind of like what I got from my hometown and from my family, like they just weren't feeling totally right to me. And so when I went away to school, especially especially someplace that had such a diverse group of people compared to where I grew up, it gave me the opportunity to just take in new information and experience things for myself. And that's when I started to have the space to actually question what I'd been told and to feel for myself what was true or what was not true. I was still feeling like a guilt for not going to church or like not like staying devout or committed, because there's so much rhetoric around, you can't question it and it's the devil tempting you if, you're questioning it, and you have to believe it and you have to believe every part of it. You can't pick and choose parts. Like there's all this rhetoric that was, very forcefully being told in that community, or at least how I heard it and I understood it. And that was creating a lot of guilt, but also like that didn't feel true either. Like that felt kind of icky. I couldn't really explain why. But the long story short was that I didn't really go to church like almost at all in college. I still considered myself Christian. Like I still had my little Bible verses around, and it wasn't something that I totally disconnected from, but it was definitely something where there was a lot more space, and I started to be able to like use my own critical thinking once I had that space, and I was able to gain experiences myself firsthand, as opposed to people telling me like what other people were like. It was funny because I feel like I first sort of made my way here to spirituality actually through like the self-help psychology route, which I've heard a lot of people share that. So like me being interested in like why I felt a certain way, or why other people felt a certain way, or why in society we tended to act certain ways, or even in college learning about like the concept of societal norms and conditioning and reinforcing and like all of those things, like was so illuminating. And so like being interested in the psychology of that all was where it started. And then again, in that episode, I explained there was a time when I was feeling really depressed and like my mental health and my physical health was suffering. And I had been curious about more than just that. I had heard about holistic health and holistic wellness and, meditating and spirituality and things like chakras and, yoga and like all this kind of stuff. And it felt like it was so connected to a world that my history had called legitimately evil and like bad, right? That in itself created resistance to me even like being open to try it for myself for so long. But I got to that place where again, I had had enough time and space from it, and where I just was feeling so icky that I finally felt open to trying meditation and going to yoga and just like looking into all of these things. Like another thing at the time was astrology. Like I was just feeling really drawn to astrology and even the tarot cards, which I'd say kind of like a particularly bad reputation in some of those religious communities. Like those are like a particular thing that are painted to have like a not good energy. But the first deck I ever got was like a really colorful, playful animals, like affirmation version of the tarot deck. I just let myself be curious and explore. And it was kind of through the contrast of what it felt like to explore my connection with source and with myself in something like spirituality versus religion that I finally started to gain some insight and perspective and language around why the religious stuff felt like it hadn't been working for me, or the type of religious communities that I had been in had not felt supportive to me. I'm going to share a few of those now, but I just want to reiterate to anybody, like, you can do whatever you want to do. Like whatever feels best to you is what is best for you. Not what I say, not what anybody else says. And I also feel like there's a way that we can do most things where it is positive for us. And there's also a way we can do most things where it's not positive for us. And I think religion is included in that. I think the way that people practice with and relate to religion and the way that they choose to let that motivate their actions is the important part, not like the religion itself necessarily. So aside from actions that like straight up do harm to people, like do whatever you want. And this is not me judging or condemning anything. This is just me explaining how I started to understand my experience with religion and the imprint that that left on me. What I discovered I kind of had the most anger about in my like early days of processing this was I had a lot of anger that I was so explicitly told not to question anything, and that my own intuition was less important or less valuable than what a priest told me or than what this Bible had told me, like this like deprioritizing and this devaluing, which was really making me not trust myself, right? Like this conditioning to not trust my own critical thinking or my own intuition was one of the first things that like really stood out to me. And I just think in general is a big red flag to look out in any situation. If it's a relationship, if it's a group of friends, if it's a job, if it's a community, whether religious or otherwise, like if they are actively reinforcing this idea that nobody's allowed to question and that you're not allowed to have your own feeling about what's good for you without you being bad or evil or going against or somehow being worse than, to me, that's a really big red flag. I've come to value so much places and people that are stable enough in their own knowing and in their own truth that they can allow other people to have their own knowing and their own truth, even if it appears to be different, even if it appears to be unknown, because I find that's what like the ego becomes most afraid of, is things that it doesn't understand and it doesn't know. And it often makes those things dangerous and makes us judge them. And then we do all sorts of weird things with it. And again, I've just come to really value spaces and people who don't do that, or choose not to do that, rather, who choose to like just have respect for people and even encourage people to connect to their heart and empower them to trust their own self and to lean on their like higher power and like to navigate situations in the way that they really feel like are best. Of course, not encouraging any harm to people, which I feel like a lot of times people aren't doing. So coming back into relationship with like my ability to be skeptical and be critical thinking and be able to say, nope, that doesn't feel true. And for that to be okay and to be welcomed, it was an experience that was like really healing for me to have after my religious experience. I also reflected, and it made me feel really sad, that it felt like the intention behind a lot of aspects of the religion and even like the energy behind Jesus or whatever of love felt like it got so distorted by humanness, by the ego essentially, right? And like the more that I learned about like where a lot of like Christian culture came from, especially in the US, is like a lot of these like big stances actually came from like political power grabbing. They didn't really come from like a heart-centered like love place. They were kind of like contorted and twisted to appear as if they're upholding the spirit of the doctrine, but really were used as like a means to an end for people trying to power grab, which is a human thing. Or even like the ego's way of identifying threats and avoiding threats and judging and all that kind of stuff. Like even that tendency to try go about soul things is, I feel like, what I observed a lot in that community, with all of the kinds of ways that it judged and there's this and right and wrong, and that felt so justified. Again, that feels like it's like the ego strategy being really heavily encouraged and reinforced, and like the spirit of what it's about feels like it got a little bit lost from my perspective. Like the spirit of, you know, unconditional love and of letting love and forgiveness and compassion guide you, and, you know, kind of finding the integrity of your own heart and learning how to stand in that and have faith and find truth. Like all of that felt like it kind of got distorted and became what humans like it to be, which is this known and rigid and rule and XYZ. Like it was kind of turned into that so that we could feel on an egoic level more comfortable with it. And that has become like the end all be all. And if you're not doing what the humans have said is the essence of the religion, then you're not being a good XYZ. You're not being a good Christian. You're letting the devil you know what I'm saying? Like it just felt really sad to me that it just didn't feel like the love was coming through. It didn't feel like people were letting the love come through, and they were letting their fear ultimately get the best of them. And then the other thing that felt like it was a big piece for me was, again, my sort of like anger with the role that the leadership in these communities had. Like I felt like a lot of the people in the church come because they're kind of like looking for somebody to help them in really vulnerable times, and it just felt like almost like an abuse of power to use some of the rhetoric that is used. Again, like diverting people to this very detailed, you have to look like this, be like this, believe these things, look this way in order to be a good XYZ. Like from what I observed, serves other things that are not actually the community, that is a little more self-serving than it is, you know, of the spirit. And it just, I don't know, like there was a part of me for a long time that felt like it was almost kind of manipulative what was happening on that greater organizational level and by the leadership there. And that really bothered me. And I feel like it was that last point that left me feeling really icky, even about the concept of God. Like for a long time, I like wouldn't even use the word God because I like had such strong associations of that with the way that my upbringing talked about God. And that was not the kind of God that felt true to me or felt supportive and healthy to me. So for a long time, I wouldn't even use that word. I would use other words because it just felt so icky. And because I still was harboring a lot of anger and resentment and like all of these kinds of feelings like towards the church, and about that experience that I had in the past. Now, this changed for me recently, and I just want to share about that really quick before I give you my little like tidbit of how I explained what I believe now in comparison to what I was taught growing up. But here's where I was at. I was noticing that I still had a lot of resistance to the word God, which felt just kind of silly, like it's just a word, And I was at that big one event that I did episode 48 about, and there was somebody that came on stage who he himself was raised by a pastor in a very evangelical church, and he's now spiritual, Aaron Abkey, if anybody's ever heard of him. And the way that he was talking, his affect, like put me right back when I was going to church. Like the way he spoke and like the energy about it was like so similar that I could feel myself like pulling back, like, oh, like I don't want anything to do with this, right? Which I could sense was so silly. Like, why am I judging this person I've never met? I didn't know anything about his content, but even just for the fact that he reminded me of how people in the church talk, I'm feeling resistant. Like that felt like so obvious to me that there was something in me that needed to be cleared, that needed to be let go. So I was like thinking through it, and I was like, what is the feeling underneath all of this? And it was the anger, it was the resentment at that experience. And I was like, okay, why am I holding that onto that? And I had this thought that came up of like, oh, well, they could still, they're causing so much harm and like they're hurting so many people. And I was like, okay, well, am I like afraid that this could still hurt me on some way? And there was a part of me that thought, yes, that like, oh, like if I was sitting in, the pulpit at church and I was sitting there, that somehow they might, bamboozle me again, or they might kind of trick me into not trusting myself, or, put me back into that feeling of being full of self-doubt and also being full of judgment that felt so icky that like there was a part of me that was afraid that would happen to me again. And when I finally acknowledged that there was a part of me that felt that way, I was like, no, like that literally would never happen again. Like you can't unring the bell, and it's okay. I just said that I love when people allow other people to be in different places than they are. And they don't judge it. They don't resist it. They just like let people be. And the only way that you can do that is when you know that them doing that doesn't harm you. And it really doesn't harm anything. Like everything is okay. And so I like got to remind myself of that in this situation and be like, no, like I don't have anything to be afraid of that energy. And then a really interesting question came up was like, did you ever have anything to be afraid of in the first place? Did it ever really harm you? I was like, oof. I had to sit with that one for a minute because I still had so many feelings of hurt, which was really just how I was relating to that experience, the story I was telling myself about that experience, about how, I was, manipulated, or I was controlled, or, all this kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, this is where I got to with it. I was like, look, at that time I was really young and I had not had the experience to like know differently or question it or whatever. So there was a certain aspect of me being more vulnerable. And I still do think that, the way that people acted in those times are not like the highest embodiment of love and truth and, encouraging people to come into their power and all that kind of stuff. But I do believe that everybody is doing what they really feel like is best. Like everybody's actually doing their best, period. Even if their best is not great, like on some level, I understand that everybody's doing their best. And the people around me at that time really felt like that was what was best. And that's why they were encouraging me and giving me those messages, etc. And when I look back, like my soul and who I am is not tarnished by that experience. Did I have some feelings and tough things to process? Sure. But like me processing those doesn't take anything away from me. I wasn't actually harmed by that. And I had the ability to find my way back to empowerment. Like as soon as circumstances happened in such a way, like God's source was guiding me straight to experiences that put me back in touch with my power. Like I had that available to me at any time, and the universe was always supporting me to get there. So like I was never really in danger, and I wasn't really harmed by that. if anything, now, after all of that, that experience has given me an even greater appreciation for my own autonomy and my own intuition, and like strengthened my conviction and my ability to find my own answers about things and not needing somebody else to tell me what the answers are just because they feel kind of difficult to access, right? Like if anything, on some level, that experience has given me the opportunity to strengthen a muscle I might not have otherwise strengthened, right? And when I let myself be open to releasing that story that I was the victim, I also am releasing the story that I was like harmed beyond my consent, or even that I could really be harmed at all. And that was a really big release for me. Again, I could still look back and acknowledge that like that's not a situation that I want to experience like that again, and that I've learned a lot and there's a lot of things that I just don't align with, you know, like that doesn't feel like the type of consciousness and the kind of energy and the kind of actions that like feel aligned for how I want to be in my life now. But it didn't harm me, and it's not going to harm me anymore, so I don't have to be afraid of it. And when I addressed the root, the fear, I could stop resisting it. And then that other piece of it was like, oh, it could still harm other people, and like this resistance to other people, like being swayed by it. But then I was like, no, but that's still me looking at them as victims too. Like as the church, as like the perpetrator, and the people in it as victims. And I'm like, but that's not really seeing them for the power that they have either. And that's not fair to them either. You know, like everybody has a choice. Everybody does. And if they want to choose to consume, you know, these messages and to act in a certain way without really questioning it themselves, or just kind of going blindly, or even if on some level like that feels true for them, even if they do question it, like everybody has their choice here. And I really believe in sort of like the divine plan for everything and the power that spirit and source has to like move through things and make things ultimately work out for the best. Like it's okay. It's okay. Everybody has their choice. Everybody has their power, which includes them being able to make choices to remove themselves from situations that are not supporting them in the ways that like make them most healthy and happy and whatever, you know? So like when I stop feeling like I gotta be like the defender of all these people who are falling victim to something, like I stop being at war with it. I stop resisting it, which is also me not energizing it anymore, because our resistance to things is us energizing it. So anyway, I walked back into this event and I was able to be so much more open to what this guy had to say, because I wasn't like putting up my guard because he just happened to remind me of, you know, my evangelical Christian days. Because like, poor guy, like of course that's his affect. It was literally how he was raised. Like, you know what I mean? So anyway, I like can say the word God now. I can honestly look at people with religion. I like watched the DCC documentary, and Reese in there was talking about like her religion and how, you know, she just wants like God to shine through her. And like I was actually able to look at it and see like beauty in it and how that could be something that felt beautiful to her and was supportive to her. And it wasn't just this like blanket judgment of like, oh, poor you, you're getting like bamboozled, or like, poor you, you're in this like cult. You know what I mean? Where like a voice, a certain part of me was still judging that. And I got to release that. I got to stop being at war with that part of my past and with that thing in my external reality. And I feel more peace. I feel more safe because I rewrote that story that it ever caused me harm in the first place, or that it could cause me harm, or that it could really like cause others harm without their consent on some level, you know? And it just feels so much more open, and it's really nice. Okay, my last couple things here is how I explained it to my parents when we had a conversation recently about how I think about things now versus what I was taught. And it was funny too how this conversation even came about, because like part of what I told them was like, if you guys really want a close relationship with me, you kind of have to like understand me. You have to know me. And I feel like, you know, in your effort to try to be supportive of me, you just don't really go there, you know, because like your faith tells you that like the way I'm going about it is not good, and you don't want to come at me about that. So you just like don't talk about it. But like you can't really be close with me if you don't know this part of me. And like my spirituality and that practice is like a ginormous part of my life. It's what I do for my job. It's literally part of every moment of my day. It's like how I think about things and approach life and move through things. So like if you aren't curious or open to just like learning about this, then you can't really know me, and we can't really be close, you know? And I feel like there's a little bit of an imbalance, because I really deeply understand your faith because you literally raised me in it, you know? And so like I get it where you're coming from, but like it feels like maybe you don't always get where I'm coming from. And me saying that, you know, sparked my mom asking, well, like, I'd love to understand, like, can you tell me a little bit more about like what you believe? So where I started was like where there are similarities, which is that I believe that like there is a source energy, a God energy, like our soul is that God energy, like we all have God in us, and that our like journey on this earth is us like more deeply connecting and getting to know that part of ourselves and living in that energy and being led by that like soul God energy in us. And that I feel like that's inherent to who we all are, like we all have that in us, and that that's like our inner compass for navigating life. I did tell her that, you know, where there was a difference was that, like, according to what feels true for me, there's not like a right way and a wrong way to like connect with the God in you. That, the idea that, Christianity is very adamant about is that like it is the truth, the way, the light, like the only way for you to really be connected to God, for you to really be able to, get to heaven, I say in quotations, that is where there is a difference. Like, I feel like there's a lot of different ways that people can connect with that spirit in them, and that they can grow a relationship with that spirit, and that they can learn to embody that spirit and let that support them. That isn't specific to like a certain religion or set of practices or whatever, which is why when we first had this conversation, I was like, I have no interest in trying to make you believe different than you believe. Like, there's no part of me that wants to make you not be Christian or like make you be spiritual like I do. Like, what works for me is not, I don't believe is exactly what works for other people. So I just want to be clear that like I'm never trying to like convert you or something, because I want you to believe what works for you. And again, that kind of being like a difference where like I don't need you to believe exactly what I believe in order for me to think that you have a correct like connection to spirit, that's just something that's a little different. It was funny, I talked about like the Bible too, my dad in particular being like the red aura that he is. Like, he really, really pushed the idea of like exactly what the Bible says. Like, you can't pick and choose, like kind of would be one of those people, very black and white about it. And I just said, look, I think that the Bible is a channeled text. And to me, what that channeled thing is when you are able to touch into such a deep connection with source, right? With the angels and your guides and the beings that are of that God energy all around you, when you're able to be in such deep connection with them that they're like directly sharing information and messages with you that you can then share, whether it's audibly or you writing them down or whatever, and that what you're sharing isn't really coming from like the human part of you, but it's coming from that sort of like God energy in you, right? And I feel like that's what the Bible was, these men that wrote these different books, like connecting to that God energy really strongly, and therefore being able to sense and interpret like those messages to share with other people. I don't believe this is the only channeled text in the world that has wisdom and guidance for us, And on top of that, like actually researching the history of the Bible, like it was not originally written in English. And even in my very preliminary studies of linguistics in college, translating languages dramatically can change the meaning and interpretation of what was written. And that's just a fact, right? Like, there are certain words that literally do not translate across languages. So you kind of have to pick the word that seems like it would be the next best word. And then even after you do that, two people can read that sentence and interpret it to mean something very different, especially with some of these kind of like abstract concepts that are written. So not only do you have all these different languages, a translation from this to this to this to this, that naturally distorts the original message just because of like the mechanics of language, but then on top of that, like we just naturally kind of project our human perspective onto things, and sometimes not even maliciously, that changes like what we think that it means. So it just feels like not totally true to me that we like do that human thing where like we grip so hard on like this specific language and insist that that is the only interpretation and it's black or white, even when our soul is kind of telling us, that doesn't really feel true. Like that, for all of the reasons that I just said, like that doesn't resonate to me. I feel like, again, like the spirit of what was said was probably lost. And if you look at early translations and check things that kind of feel a little off on your intuition, you find that they weren't actually really talking about that initially. And again, that there are other channeled texts, like really powerful, spiritual leaders and from other religions that also have a lot of truth and a lot of guidance for us. So that kind of like plays into what I'd said before about that. I don't feel like there's only like this one way and that's the right way and everything else is wrong. And even when we speak in the right and wrong language, like that's a sign that there's ego stuff, That was just my thought about it. And then one of my last things was that this whole concept of like heaven and hell, I was like, I also feel like that's a case of like it being interpreted a little bit more literally than was intended. Like to me, I feel like that talks about the type of experience that you can have, right? So hell being suffering, hell being locked in fear and in judgment and in shame, like that experience is this hell that it feels like to me that a lot of the people in the Bible are really speaking about. And heaven being the place where you are like embodying love. You're embodying the nature of your soul, and you're therefore able to experience extreme bliss and abundance. And I feel like that's something we can actually access and experience as we move through life at any moment. And when they're talking about all the ways to get to heaven, what they're trying to describe is the ways to like shift your consciousness to allow yourself to experience that and to release the suffering, which is really releasing the ego patterns and the traumas and, you know, the limiting beliefs and the suffering and the shaming, and like how to release like some of those aspects so that you can have a different kind of experience while you're here. I don't think it's actually talking about like afterwards you're either burning in some bad place or you get to go in the cool place, you know? And even the thing with Jesus, like it feels true to me that Jesus like is one of those ascended master energies, like one of those angels that we can connect to, and that he very well probably incarnated on the earth as a lot of the ascended masters have done. And because of his potency and his connection to that vibration, like made such a strong impact with his messages and his actions and whatever, and that he represents and is kind of like an embodiment of that love energy of even like the Christ consciousness grid that, you know, is around the earth as a way to help us humans access that fourth dimensional vibration and energy. And it's really interesting too, because if we're starting on the 3-dimensional and there's this grid or this access point that was created for us to, you know, access a next level dimension higher, which is love. And if they say, you know, ascension is like 5th dimensional and higher, then technically love is the way to ascension. So again, like it just kind of depends on how you want to like interpret some of those, you know, very popular messages that come from like Christian, you know, religious kind of places. But yeah, I was like, you know, I still like believe in the Holy Spirit in terms of like spirit is literally all around us. I'm like connecting with God and, you know, trusting in God and God's plan and, you know, trying to be a servant of God in what I do, literally in the work that I do, like all the time, you know, like embodying those qualities of the Spirit, like forgiveness and compassion and honesty and love and truth and like faithfulness. Like those are all things that feel very true and feel in alignment with like that energy that feels like where I'm in my most integrity, which is my soul energy, you know? And it was interesting because she was like, wow, like some of that like doesn't sound so different. And I was like, yeah, because it's not. Like where it is different, it's really different, but like it's actually not as different as like you would think, you know? And it's funny too, like even thinking about the tools that we use now, like astrology or tarot or whatever, I feel like all of these are just tools, honestly, tools of nature, especially astrology and like even like people who practice paganism, like it's really rooted in like nature and the laws of nature and the seasons, right? And like we're so deeply connected to nature, both spiritually and physically, that of course we can intuit wisdom, and that can be a channel in which we can understand our own God energy by looking to and really being curious and observing those things, you know? And astrology, you know, being the way that, again, an extension of our physical reality, like our solar system, that like how those energies are reflecting energies here on earth, and, you know, tarot being symbols that we can use to create synchronicity, that we can use to create connection and communication with our own like intuition with our own soul, you know, that there's nothing inherently bad about any of that. It really is just about our intention. And if God created everything and if God is everywhere, then how are those things evil, especially when they're not like causing harm to any person, and if they're helping people deepen their relationship to themselves, deepen their relationship to the God that's in them, you know, help them get clarity on how to release the suffering and the hell and be able to embody more of that heaven energy. Like, why would any of that be bad? So that's sort of like my story about, you know, moving from religion to spirituality. And, you know, I hear about a lot of people who still go to church and identify with Christianity and are very spiritual and very intuitive, and they're able to navigate that in a way that's healthy for them. I do think that what makes that a lot easier is that they're also surrounded by a community of people who are more committed to like living the spirit of love and of God than they are committed to the doctrine and the rules and the judgment. Because I find that can be a really tricky thing for people to navigate as they're trying to like really live and be good Christians or like good people or like whatever it is, that it can be really hard to distinguish the two. And so you'll have people respond to you trying to like reinforce you to stay in the good because they think they're trying to help you. But really, again, I find personally that when you're in that energy, you're actually blocking God from moving through you, you know, like when you're not listening to your intuition and when you're being sort of restricted by the box of what, you know, a certain doctrine or religion tells you is good or not, instead of asking yourself, is it true or not? Is it good or not? You know? So the people, again, that I've heard that still like have positive experiences and feels like it's really supportive is not only have they themselves, you know, come back into a place of power and connection and trust with their own self and their own intuition and their own ability to decide what is true and good for them, but they have people around them that are not judging and blocking the way that God can move through them. They're not interested in saying what's good or bad, and they're just interested in loving people and supporting people. And I know that there's people like that out there, but I've also known a lot of people who have had to like put that down altogether and just take the pieces that worked for them and kind of leave the rest, because that can be really hard to find. Because again, I've just found that like the institution of it isn't really reflecting that openness and that love and that non-judgment that feels a little bit more in alignment with the actual spirit of what God and love is, at least to me. So again, do what feels good for you. Do what feels true for you. Like find your way. Do more of this work of like having God show you what his own spirit is, having source and your soul show you what is true, and kind of distinguishing what is the ego and fear-based stuff so that you just have that information to choose how you want to live. And I know that you're going to figure it out. I know that I did. And I believe that everybody else can too. And I believe that, you know, everything here that exists serves its purpose on some level. And even if people are finding a lot of purpose and, you know, happiness in something that's different than me, like I don't feel the need to make that bad anymore. You know, I found what's worked for me. I found what gives me peace. And I just hope that for everybody, and especially doing the work I do in the Akashic Records, like everybody has their own path, their own karma, their own lessons they're trying to learn on like a soul level. And it's not the end of the world if they have kind of like a clunky experience for a lifetime. Like it's okay. Let me know if you have any questions about that, or if there's any other aspects of this that you would be curious for me to speak to, I guess. I hope that this was supportive to anybody that's trying to move through like navigating maybe from that kind of background, or maybe if somebody's just curious about people who move through that because that's like really foreign to them. I hope that this was informative and supportive. I love you guys all so much, and I'll see you next week for more breakthroughs. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode and for tuning in to Breakthroughs with Bree. Please share your favorite episodes with your friends and loved ones, and please like, subscribe, and rate the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it, as it helps me continue to create these episodes to help support your breakthroughs. I would love to stay connected with you, so please follow me on social media at Healing with Bree. Please check out my website at healingwithbree.net, which will always have the most up-to-date information about the services that I'm currently offering. And please consider using the link in the show descriptions to subscribe to my email list so you can be the first to hear about any offerings. You can get all of the free resources that I offer, as well as get my weekly channeled messages. My deepest love and gratitude to you, and I can't wait to have more breakthroughs with you next week.